We're live.
Thank you. Well, good evening, everyone. Welcome to this postponed and pre-meeting of the Audit and Standards Committee. Do we have any apologies for absence?
I've not received any apologies, no.
Okay, thank you. Minutes of the previous meeting. We all had the minutes of the previous meeting. Yeah. Everybody happy with those? Yes? No objections? Fantastic. Thank you very much. Item 3, declarations of interest. Anyone have anything to declare? Nope. I bet we can't keep this pace up. Item 4, external audit. To receive an update from BDO, the councillors, external auditors, on their work to audit the council's financial statements. Officer Blom.
Chairman, shall I just introduce very briefly? Steve Bladen's here from BDO, and you've got on the agenda tonight the report on how they're conducting the audit of the 1920 accounts. And obviously, Steve has just turned up to give the committee a briefing on where they're currently at and other issues as well. So with your permission and through you, Chair, I'll just hand over to Steve now to introduce the report. Thank you. Okay,
thank you. Steve.
Thank you, Chair. Good evening, members. So as Martin's just said, there's really two items from us this evening. So firstly, there's our 2019-20 audit planning report. And as Martin says, this really just sets out the way that we will undertake our audit for 2019-20. And then I'll give you an update on the progress we've made so far in terms of our audit, in terms of that audit. So if I first start with the planning report itself, so I'll assume the document has been read, and I'm only really going to focus on the key aspects of this. So I think to start with,
could I just ask, what is the purpose of this document?
Well, essentially, Councillor Betton, it's to set out how we propose to undertake our audit for 2019-20. So typically what we would do in advance of doing that audit is set out the kind of process that we will go through to be able to give you an opinion on your financial statements. And in doing that, we will set out things like the materiality level we've adopted for that audit and we've identified. We would do that. We would tend to do that well in advance of starting that audit. Unfortunately, this is the first meeting that we have had the opportunity to bring that report to since the last meeting was in April, I think.
Yes, I mean, the purpose of my question is basically I noticed that it was dated the 31st of July and we received it last week. There's a lot of the content of the document is about interactive processes and making sure that things are done the right way. I assume that you've actually not almost finished the audit now.
No, we haven't almost finished the audit, Councillor Betton, no.
So have you, how far along is it? Because a lot of what's in this document is moot, depending on how far you've got.
Well, we started our final audit back in mid-October, so we've made progress in some areas, but we're nowhere near in a position to have completed that audit as yet, or report our findings to you.
When is it scheduled to have been completed? Because I know we put it back to the beginning of January.
So we haven't put the audit itself back to the beginning of January. What we have
The
said is
report.
our intention is to bring our final report to your next meeting, which I think is on the 18th of January.
Yeah, I was just, last year there were delays and loads of problems, and this year it seems that there are more delays, and why is that acceptable?
Well, I can go through if you want me to, Councillor Bitton, I can go through the progress on the audit and set out where we're up to and give you some of the reasons for those delays. And I was fully intending
I think that's
to
going to
that.
be your second part, isn't it?
It was, yes,
Yeah.
yeah, that's right.
So just, Councillor Malvaganam, you have a
Thank you, Chair.
question.
Thank you, Chair. Appreciate that. I want to ask a question of Steve Bolden. It's dated the 31st of July, Steve, and literally has been put on our website today. Can you confirm this is the first time you have actually released it to the council, or did you release it to the council some time ago?
So we shared a copy of the audit plan with officers. So that would have been with Martin's predecessor back in July.
Okay.
Ordinarily, if I could just finish that,
sure.
Councillor Malvaganam. Ordinarily, what we would do is we would share that report with officers and agree that report with officers, and then we would take it to a meeting of the Audit and Standards Committee. Obviously, since there hasn't been a meeting of the Audit and Standards Committee since last April, so this is the first opportunity that we've had to bring that report to members.
Sorry, Chair, could I accept that since you released it as a first Audit and Standards Committee. My question is to the exec. I see that there's only one exec member here, which is Adrian Page. I'm disappointed to see the finance exec is not here, leader is not here, deputy leader is not here. I would have thought the officers would have discussed the audit planning report with at least one exec, if there was a process to do that. And also, it was not even highlighted to the Audit and Standards Committee chair that they had a copy of it. That's my question is, when did the officers have it? And why wasn't it even sent on to the Audit and Standards Committee chair? Because I'm going through this. I have, in a rush this afternoon, gone through the entire 40 plus. But we are not blaming you, Steve, okay? That let's make it abundantly clear. I'm not blaming anybody. I've gone through the entire 46 pages of this document, and there are items in here which the exec had highlighted to the Audit and Standards Committee chair. Possibly, Audit and Standards Committee chair could have had some input into the planning process. Very clearly, the exec has not been informed. I'm quite disappointed. Nothing to do with this. I repeat, absolutely nothing to do with you. Quite disappointed it's not even brought to our attention. Maybe Adrian, Councillor Page could answer that on behalf of the exec.
No, I can't answer that.
Quite disappointing, very disappointing. Okay, on we go. I'm sure there are lots more questions.
Okay, let's move on, shall we? Yeah, my concern was the date, and there's a large document, and all of a sudden we've got it. But apparently we've had it for some while. Councillor Bates, you have a hand up.
Thank you, Chairman. I haven't seen the report until it was sent to me last week in the post, so I haven't been jumped the gun or anything. I certainly haven't had it before the Chairman. There was 2 points I wanted to raise on it. One is kind of alluding to the comment that you and Councillor Wagner have made, in that I read on page 26 of the report. I'll read this paragraph out because I appreciate members of the public won't necessarily have seen this, but I'm going to read it. And it's under the area of other matters requiring further discussion on the section marked fraud. So we haven't obviously discussed it over the last few months because there hasn't been a meeting. We have been made aware of a small number of low value, actual, alleged or suspected instances of fraud reported by the council. We request confirmation from the Audit and Standards Committee on fraud and a discussion on the controls and processes in place to ensure timely identification and action. Now, I have to say, I'm not aware of any allegations of fraud that have been reported to me, at least none that I can recall. And I can't speak for any other group leader. But that was very surprising to me, that paragraph was in there, and that that we hadn't been made aware of it, because that to me is actually serious. I appreciate low value. It's difficult to know what low value means. If it means that it was of a level lower than the previous year's materiality, that would have been under 4.5 million. So clearly, I'm sure we're not talking about that kind of level. But I would have thought that where there are incidences of fraud, at least the chairman of the Audit and Standards Committee should be made aware of that, even if they're confidential matters, or the leader or group leaders. There's various confidential processes in place that incidences like this, you don't need to involve individual named officers or anything like that, are made aware of those, because that's exactly what the purpose of this committee is. So I'm not quite sure what's happened here. I'm not quite sure why the meeting was delayed in July. That's not my decision, but that's obviously quite a concerning paragraph in there. And the second point, which also merits a discussion, which I guess we do tonight, but I assume has already been kind of as part of the current audit, is regarding the materiality for this year, which is proposed to be 56,000 rather than 4.5 million. And I agree with that. I think 56,000 as 2% of gross revenue expenditure seems to me a far more sensible level. That I'm not an auditor, there's people who are more expert than me, but I think if there are going to be issues regarding that, I think the lower level seems to be a sensible level to me, in terms of what it describes as clearly trivial. So I would agree with that. I think we're being asked to make a decision on that tonight, according to this report, but that would be what I would agree with. But it does concern me that some of this information in the council's knowledge does not appear to have been given to councillors who needs to know about it. And I think, and I would just leave it like that. I'm sure the chairman and the leader of the Liberal Democrat group will take that up themselves.
Thank you, Councillor Bates. Councillor Hawkins.
Thank you, Chairman. 2 points there. I think all councillors should be made aware of any fraud, whether they're group leaders or otherwise, because, Councillor Bates saying that he hasn't been made aware as a group leader. We are all equal elected representatives, and we should all be made aware of fraud. Now, it's degrees of materiality there. I accept that there may be small cases, but those should certainly flow through to the chairman in the first instance. And as far as the leader and deputy leader and the finance portfolio holder not being present at this meeting, they're not members of this team, this committee. And I think Councillor Page is on this as a councillor and not as an executive member. If Councillor Malvarigan wanted to scrutinise or ask questions of the leader, he has the other avenues to do that. They're not here to be scrutinised in their roles. Our role, as I see it, and I've always understood in these meetings, unless the rules have changed, is that we scrutinise the papers in front of us and make recommendations to the executive. And then they flow on from there. So any questions that councillor, any of us have, would then be fed through to the relevant portfolio holders. But we are all here as councillors and not in our other roles that we may or may not have within the council. Thank you, Chairman.
Yeah, thank you, Councillor Hawkins. I think, Mr. Bladen, that you see the kind of issues that we have with the late arrival to us of this document. I too had highlighted in yellow on my screen below the paragraph that Councillor Bates just raised, and on the opposing column it says we request input from the Audit and Standards Committee on recent claims, which we can't do because we haven't had the opportunity. So this the going back to my original question, what's the point of this document? It's too late, really. Now, that's not your fault. If you sent it in July to the previous holder of the Section 151 position, who we had a meeting last week, and he had only just received it himself. So, you know, it's been hanging around, but nobody knows where it is. And I think going forward, it would be helpful if there was better, more efficient, quicker, earlier communication. So
Okay.
rant
Okay.
over.
Councillor Betton, do you want me to go through the rest of the report and pick up those questions, or do you want me to pick up those questions first and then go through the rest of the report? Because I appreciate if members haven't had the opportunity to study the report in detail, then I'm very happy to take them through the key points of the report, which is what I was proposing to do anyway.
I think that would be valuable.
Okay.
Yeah.
And I'll address the questions as I go, if that's okay with members.
Okay.
So to start with, I'd probably direct members to page 5 of our report, and picking up on the points that Councillor Bates made in relation to materiality. So we've actually set overall materiality at 1.4 million, and that is based on 2% of gross expenditure. So our view is that that's the key area of focus for the users of the financial statements. The figure of 56,000 is the clearly trivial level that we set for our audit. So what, in effect, what that means is that any errors that we identify in the financial statements that are over 56,000, we would report those to the committee. But the overall level of materiality that we've set is actually 1.4 million. So that's higher than that £56,000. So I wanted to then move on and just talk about the risks that we've identified, because I think that's key that members understand what those significant risks are that we're seeking to address as part of our audit. So page 7 sets out a summary of those risks that we've identified, and the detail behind these is then set out on pages 14 to 23. So in terms of the financial statements, we've actually identified what we call 4 significant risks. So the first 2 of these are risks that are in a sense mandated by auditing standards, and you would see those on the vast majority of audit plans that either get brought to you or to any other local authority. So the first of those is around the management override of control. So this risk just really recognises the fact that management potentially have the opportunity and the ability to override controls that would otherwise appear to be operating effectively, and have present a favourable financial position to the council. The work that we will do will address that risk in a number of ways, but primarily it's through our testing of journals, a review of estimates made by management, and a review of significant transactions that are disclosed within or that are within the financial statements. We also identify or we also test additions and disposals to both non-current assets, so property, plant and equipment in effect, and investment property, really just to make sure that that expenditure has been classified correctly within the financial statements. Excuse me. So the second risk, or the second significant risk that we've identified, is in relation to revenue recognition. Now, essentially, that risk is focusing on whether income and expenditure has been recognised in the correct accounting period. And again, we will address that risk through our substantive testing of income and expenditure transactions, and really just making sure that all of that expenditure is recorded in the correct accounting period. Now, the third significant risk that we've identified is around the valuation of property assets, and that includes both other land and buildings and investment property. Now, the reason that we identified that significant risk is because of the high degree of judgment and estimation uncertainty in assessing the value of those assets. So our work will focus on a number of areas in addressing that risk, but it includes reviewing the work of the valuer appointed by the council, to value those assets. We'll look at whether those assets have been valued on the correct basis, and reviewing the information that underpins the value of those assets. So for example, we'll look at the lease agreements or floor plans that set out the size of those assets. But I think it's also key that, that we look at how changes in the valuation of those assets have been accounted for, and we will be doing that as part of our audits and looking at those reserve movements. I did want to highlight that in our auditor's report, we are likely to issue an emphasis of matter opinion. And what that will do is it will draw attention to the valuation of those properties. And really that's just reflecting the fact that at the end of March 2020, there was limited information available to valuers on the effect of COVID-19 on property valuations. So we will just draw attention to that. Now, the council's not alone in this. We're expecting that most of our local government bodies with significant property holdings will have a similar paragraph within their within their auditor's report. So the final significant risk that we've identified is in relation to the valuation of the pension fund. And again, that's largely because driven by its value and the degree of estimation uncertainty. And in terms of how we will address that risk, we will rely largely on the value on the work undertaken by the auditor of Surrey Pension Fund and reviewing the assumptions used by the actuary in determining the value of the council's liability. We've identified a number of other risks around bad debt provisions and going concern, and in particular the disclosures made by the council in relation to going concern. So that's looking at how the council's managing its financial position and the disclosures that it's making around that. We also, as members will I'm sure be aware, required to give an opinion on the council's use of resources. So that's commonly known as our value for money conclusion. So we've identified two significant risks in relation to that. So as I've already mentioned, the first of those is around the way that the council's managing its financial position and the steps that it's taking to address the gaps that's identified in its medium-term financial strategy. And obviously there'll be a read across from that risk to the work we will do around going concern. The second risk is essentially around the way that the council prepares its financial statements. So this risk is recognising that our audit of the 18-19 financial statements, so in the prior year, identified a significant number of errors and control deficiencies. So we know obviously that the council's taken some steps to strengthen its process in relation to those, but we will assess the extent to which those have been successful and which they're embedded. Also, just the last few points, wanted to draw members' attention to the way in which we'll audit the amounts that are incorporated into the council's accounts in relation to the Main Square Camberley Unit Trust. So the trust's accounts are incorporated into the financial statements prepared by the council. So the trust is a separate entity, but it is also audited by BDO Jersey. So what we will do is, where we are able to, we will place reliance on the work undertaken by the Jersey team. However, it's important to note that the trust has a different year end to the council, and so we will need to supplement the work that the BDO Jersey team does in auditing that trust with specific testing on certain transactions, and that will include the valuation of the property assets, because in the trust's accounts they're valued at the 31st of December 2019, and in the council's accounts we're looking at the value at 31st of March 2020. Lastly, I just wanted to confirm our independence and that we're not aware of anything that would impact on our ability to undertake an independent audit. And lastly, just highlight on page 8 details of our audit fees, which we've set out for you. I guess the key things I kind of wanted to feedback from members is whether you're content with the level of materiality that we've proposed, but also in terms of page 26 of our report, where we've set out our responsibilities around fraud, and claims against the council. All I really need from members is an indication of whether they're aware of anything material that they wish to bring to our attention. So I have discussed this with officers, and I've been made aware of some very small value areas of fraud that wouldn't impact material in our audit opinion. But if members did want to raise anything with me, then I'm happy to obviously take that away and reflect on that. So I'll pause there, Councillor Betton, and obviously take any questions, and then happy to give an update on the progress of our audit separately.
Okay. Councillor Malvaganam.
Thank you, Chair. Sorry, I'm just referring back to page number 8 on the fees. This was asked of the chair at the last audit meeting to verify that the audit fee itself for last year, I'm not questioning this year, last year's audit fee, and we were supposed to, the officers should have come back to us confirming what the audit fee was. Can you confirm you have been informed of the actual audit fee we were supposed to have paid? I do appreciate the video partner actually giving us a schedule, but I'm actually quite surprised that the fee has ended up at 83,000 instead of the 35,000. And I do appreciate all the also fact that the previous partner had to do some extra work. But did this go through the right process, Chair?
Without asking Mr. Bladen, I think it does say there's a note on my copy, at least, that the fees are that's an aspiration rather than that's what's been paid. Is that correct, Mr. Bladen?
Yeah. So if I could take that, Chair. So the code audit fee, the 35,347, that's the fee that is set by PSAA Limited for the audit of the council's financial statements and value for money conclusion. We have actually proposed an amendment to that fee, so that's the 48,228. And what that reflects is, well, if members remember, we brought a lengthy report back to the last meeting in April 2020 that set out the errors that we identified in dealing with the 18-19 audit. So the volume of those errors is the reason that we have proposed the amendments to the scale fee. It's also related to the fact that in recent years, the complexity of the council's audit has increased significantly. So the acquisition of the JPUT, for example, has really increased the amount of work that we're required to do to give an opinion on the council's financial statements. So our intention is to submit a request to PSAA to vary the fee, and ultimately it's PSAA that are responsible for determining that fee. But nevertheless, we do bring it to your attention for you to consider it.
Thank you for the answer. I appreciate that.
A question that I have, and it's because I'm not a financial person, as anybody who knows me knows. And I've had a meeting with Mr. Horn to try and understand how the finances work, which was very informative. And I thank him for that publicly here. But what it came down to, for my understanding, and I've sent an email, so I think I understood it correctly because no one said I got it wrong, that how the Camleys Square appears in the accounts depends on why we bought it. And on page 25, your second line states that the principal activity of the trust is to invest in real estate for capital appreciation and collection of rental income. Now, it is my understanding that some people believe that to be the case, and other people would have you believe that it was for the regeneration of the town centre and it's not an investment at all. Now it seems to me quite clearly set out there in the second line on page 25 of the report that it's for generating income, not regeneration.
So my understanding is that the trust acquired the property for the capital appreciation and the collection of the rental income, but the council then acquired the trust for regeneration purposes. And the fact that the council had acquired it for regeneration purposes is why it's disclosed in the council's accounts as other land and buildings and not investment property.
Sorry, I'm sorry, Chair. I'm a bit confused.
Please, somebody, I'm confused.
Because my understanding here seems to be, because we put it into the balance sheet and depreciate it, as I understand it from speaking to accountants and some of the officers, it is both the investment part as much as the regeneration part. Having read the documents which I have, it's very clear it's for both purposes, because it also carries the MRP, relating to this particular investment. So I presume, it's a fact that this should wash its face through is in its entire of its life of our investment, which is supposed to be 50+ years. But I do accept it's all for regeneration as much as for investment. Part of that reason was where your previous audit partner decided to bring it into as a property portfolio and depreciate it. That's my understanding from the last audit meeting we had.
So if I could just answer that, hopefully briefly, Councillor Malvangham. So the code of audit or accounting practice that the council complies with in compiling its accounts, you can only recognise an asset as an investment property if it is held solely for capital appreciation or rental income. If you're holding it for both purposes, then it should be disclosed as other land and buildings.
Okay, that's fine. I understand. So okay. It is, we bought it for both purposes, but because you are disclosing it for the purpose for this statutory purpose, you are disclosing it as an asset. But in reality, you recognize the fact that it was bought for both purposes because there's a market implication. Am I right in saying that?
I understand the council acquired it for both purposes, but in terms of the accounts, it has to be shown.
That's fine. No, okay. That's all. That's the only clarification I need from you for today. Thank you.
Okay.
Yes, thank you. That's cleared it up in my mind. That's so. If and Martin, please correct me if I'm wrong. If that sentence could be rewritten to make it clear to non-believers like myself that this is not the principal, I mean, not the sole activity, then that would be okay. Then I wouldn't get confused. Is that right?
And Dr. Chair, that document is from the auditor.
Yes, I know. I'm asking Martin's opinion.
Yeah, through you, Chair. I think the point is that obviously the JPUT when it was held by previous owners, they were holding for the purposes of capital appreciation and investment income from rent stream. But when the council acquired it, as Steve Bladen's pointing out, we acquired it for both investment but also for regeneration purposes as well. So
okay, yes, thank you, Martin. And the reason I sort of go on about this is because I've had conversations, emails, whatever, with residents who know far more about accounting than I do, and I need to get it clear in my own head exactly why things are as they are. Now I don't know that would mollify all of the residents, but it certainly makes it clear in my head why it can be treated as a regeneration fund and go in the accounts in one way,
Yes,
rather than investment and go in the accounts in another.
absolutely. That's right.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Anybody else? Sorry, Councillor Bates.
Thank you. Yes, I'm not going to discuss the regeneration or otherwise of the MAL because I think that has been discussed at length already. But can I just go back to that paragraph I raised before, which has just been touched on again, where we're talking about small number of low value actual, alleged or suspected instances of fraud. Now, I appreciate you can't go into detail of that because there may be, for all I know, some internal matters and whatever going on about that. But can you just give us some idea as to what the word small number means and what is low value? Because obviously that may be important for us to understand as councillors. What kind of figures are we actually talking about here?
So you would be speaking or talking about less than £10,000, and so I am typically referring to things like housing benefit fraud. I don't have an exact figure. I obviously discussed it with with Martin's predecessor, and that was the information that we were given, is that there would be a small number of housing benefit frauds, but they were of a nature that wouldn't be material to our opinion on the financial statements.
So, Chairman, just to be clear then, when we're talking about low value actual, alleged or suspected instances of fraud, what we're talking about in the main are not necessarily acts that may have been undertaken by agents of the council, i.e. councillors or officers, but it may be where money such as benefit claims or other similar aspects may have been paid at a slightly higher or lower amount than what they should have been, particularly a slightly higher amount, and therefore the council has to look at overpayment of or getting that money back through some means. So perhaps somebody has failed to declare their partner actually lives at the property and that kind of stuff. Is that the kind of thing that we're talking about? And that we're not actually talking about conduct of officers or members?
Yeah, it's frauds perpetrated against the council rather than by employees of the council.
Okay, great.
Okay, that's good to know. Thank you for raising that, Councillor Bates. Councillor Hawkins.
Thank you, Chairman. Yeah. Also, thank you, Councillor Bates, for that raising that clarification, because it is important. And I know that our anti-fraud team work very hard at seeking and repayment, and they are successful. And there are a number of cases which go to court, and I think they do a tremendous job. But I'm sorry to go back on this question of regeneration or investment. I mean, Councillor Mulberrigan is correct in that the MAL does have an investment element in it, in that the rents generated will be required to deal with the minimum lending rate or minimum lending payment, I think it is. And
through you, Chairman, it's the MRP, the minimum revenue provision.
Yeah,
thank you, Chair.
So, and in essence, we have a maturing investment holding, which at the end of the period of time, which is 50 years from when we took the loans, we get the unencumbered freehold. So just for clarification, the accounts say this year, I stress this year because it could be very different next year once the J-put is collapsed. And that's going to be an interesting conversation for everybody. But this year, the accounts say that it is held for regeneration payment, notwithstanding what certain interested parties may say outside the chamber. It is in the accounts as an regeneration element, and that is in line with SIPFA requirement. Yes?
Yeah, my understanding is the property is held primarily for regeneration purposes, and therefore it's in the accounts, not as investment property, but as other land and buildings, which is in accordance with SIPFA's Code of Audit Practice.
Thank you. Anyone else?
Sorry, I don't want to be laboring this point. I mean, Councillor Edward is right. We recognize it's almost a 50-50 scenario. Shouldn't we be rewording that? This is a question for the audit as much as the officers, as much as the finance exec to discuss it through, because very clearly we know it's for both purposes. So going forward, we are not confused at what the accounts are saying come next year as much as anything else when JPUT is liquidated. In the sense that when I say next year, the year we are in.
Yes, next financial year rather than the one we're auditing, talking about the audit. Yeah, I think it's just a question of the language. I mean, in terms of Councillor Bates's point about the fraud, if you read that one way, it's terrible. If you read it as you explained it, no problem. And I think that applies here with this, the activity of the trust and everything else. It just needs a little bit of clarification to make it more obvious to the uninitiated. Is that possible?
I don't know if that's a question for you, Martin, or for me, but I'm very happy to discuss with Martin alternative wording for that.
Yeah, absolutely.
As we go through
the
audit.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, thank you. That's fine. Is that everyone happy now with the Clyde report?
Yeah.
Yes.
I got lots of questions, but I won't keep Steve. I'm sure he's missing his dinner by now.
So can we move on then to the audit itself?
No, very quickly. Very quickly. Big picture. Big picture. Yeah. The sort of the audit is you're going through this process right now. It should be ready for the 2nd. Yes. Sorry, in January, somewhere in January.
Yep.
For the audit and standards committee meetings. We discussed the fees. The other important part is about the reserves, which I personally have written to you as a performance and scrutiny chair. I think that from what I hear, I'm telling that is the reply you gave me and the reply I got from the Section 151 officer. It's kind of there or thereabouts. Maybe that also possibly need to be explained fully in the accounts this year. So when JPUT collapses or whatever it is, what happens to the usable reserves, if at all anything happens? Yeah, because we have to be careful how we define the usable reserves, because the way I'm looking at it as of now, the accounts, the draft accounts, this is as if the council has made about 39-40 million, yeah, usable reserves, and the unusable reserves are gone the other way. That's what it seems on the face of it. Yeah. So, but if that was the case, we'll be a very rich, extremely rich council every year if we can continue to do that. Maybe that's not the case. Maybe that should be looked at this year in the accounts, so people outside are aware what may potentially happen next year. Yeah.
So perhaps to give you some assurance, Councillor Malcolm, one of the...
Call me Sashi, Steve, I know you.
Okay, okay, Sashi. So one of the areas that we will be looking at is obviously the JPUT assets have changed significantly in value in the 1920 accounts. So alongside looking at the valuation of those assets, we do want to look at the reserve movements that there have been in relation to those assets. I can't give you an answer on whether or not we think those reserve movements are correct, because we just haven't completed our work on that yet.
Okay,
but
fine.
if it is any reassurance, it is something that we will be looking at.
Thank you very much for that, Steve.
Okay,
I appreciate that.
you. Can we now move on to where you are with the audit, please?
Yep, sure. So I think before I give you an update, I think it's just worth highlighting that in response to the COVID-19 pandemic, the government made a number of changes to the deadlines applying to 1920 accounts. So I think it's worth saying that firstly, the deadline for authorities to prepare accounts was moved from 31st of May to the end of July. And the deadline for auditors was then moved from the end of July to the end of November. So our audit of the council's financial statements is in progress at the moment. We've made progress in a number of areas, but there's still a reasonable amount of work which we need to do, and our work is ongoing. So unfortunately, we won't be in a position to issue our auditor's report before the 30th of November, which I think you're already aware of. There's a number of reasons for this. So members will be aware that sign-off of our 18-19 audit was significantly late. So we issued our auditor's report around 5 months after the deadline of 30th of September. And that was because of the number of issues we identified by that audit. So pending completion of that audit, we planned the start of our 1920 audit. It was delayed until March. Unfortunately, the COVID-19 pandemic and the need for us to then work remotely meant that we were unable to complete as much work as we would have hoped during the interim period. Over the autumn, we have sought to catch up as much as we can, but as I've already mentioned, we won't have caught up sufficiently to be able to issue that opinion before the end of November. I think it's fair to say that we're not alone in this. So my understanding is that there will be a large number of local government audits across all suppliers that are likely to be delayed. And as at the end of last week, the actual number of audits that had been completed was very small. In terms of progress, I mean, we've made reasonable progress in things like cash investments held by the council, expenditure, debtors and creditors, but as I say, there's still a fair amount that we need to do, particularly in terms of the valuation of some of those property assets and the reserve movements. I think the one thing I would say, and I've already touched on it, is some members of the committee may be aware that I've received a number of emails, each of which are broadly similar in nature. So many of them questioning the value of the unit trust, so in effect the shopping centre or the mall, and the way in which the council have accounted for the changes in its value. So where I've responded to those emails, I've simply said that it is something that we will look at, but I can't give an opinion on it at the moment because we haven't completed our work in that area. I think that's really just consistent with what I've said to members this evening. Until we complete that work, I won't be able to respond to those detailed emails. Obviously happy to take any questions on the progress.
Thank you. I suspect we all know people who've suffered with COVID because working from home, not only does it stop people working together, but you also lose staff because they become ill. Certainly in my business, that's the case. We're just glad that no one's suffered really badly. And I hope you're in the same sort of situation. We will be discussing the audit report on the meeting of the 18th, which is 2 weeks, 2 full working weeks into January. Will you be able to deliver the report give us a week to look at it before we have the meeting?
So that's our intention, Councillor Betton. We expect to be working on the audit throughout December and then be able to deliver a draft report for Martin to review in the first instance in the early part of January. I won't guarantee at this stage that there won't be some areas that we notice still being outstanding, but we will give you at least a week to be able to review what we have completed at that stage and then give you an update on the 18th on any areas that are still outstanding at that point.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Malvagnam.
Steve, just a simple question. I just want confirmation that you're aware there is a plan to collapse Jaipur. Yep.
Yes, I am, Sashi.
Okay.
Yes.
Thank you.
Anyone else? All happy? Yes, good, excellent. Well, thank you very much. I think you know, better communications going forward will serve us well.
Okay, yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. Moving on, internal annual report.
Thanks, Steve.
Thank you.
I think that's for me, Mr. Chairman, is it?
I think so, Alex, yes.
Good evening, all members. I'm just going to bring up my screen so I can go through my first report with you. Bear with me. All this modern technology we've got to learn. Okay, so I want, as you know, members, this is a report that the internal audit team bring to Audit and Standards on an annual basis. This should have been brought to the July meeting, but obviously that was postponed. So this is the earliest meeting that we can bring this report to you. The report's basically got three aims: to provide an overall opinion on the adequacy and effectiveness of the council's control environment. Secondly, to disclose any qualifications to that opinion and with reasons. And the third objective is to present a summary of the audit work for the 1920 financial year. So I just really wanted to go through the key points of the report with members. And the purpose of the report is for members to note and to provide any comments to the report afterwards, if that's okay. So first of all, the audit work programme is directed by the 3-year audit strategy, which is agreed at member level each January. So I think that was approved the January just gone, so that's valid for 3 years from January. For the 1920 financial year, we completed 21 audits from the plan, as well as 2 or 3 additional ad hoc pieces of work, which I brought those to the attention of the report. They're not just, you know, the odd hour here or there in terms of advice. They're proper pieces of audit work where we probably needed to provide an audit report at the end back to management. Members are aware that at the end of each audit, we provide an audit report that contains a summary of the work, the control areas that we reviewed, our testing, our test sample, where we got our testing from, the testing population, as well as any areas for improvement. And those are the key areas that management at Surrey Heath need to be aware about. And we have to work through our improvement plans with them. Now, they don't always agree, those plans, obviously. Some of them rely on resourcing. Some of them rely on other work that's going on at the time. So obviously there's a bit of toing and froing and negotiation, but overall, I can report back to members that the majority of the audit recommendations that we raise are actually approved at management level, which is good. So the report really then goes on to talk about the detail of the audits. At paragraph 10, I've highlighted that last year we raised 108 audit recommendations. I don't have the specific number of recommendations from the 18-19 financial year, but I dare say it was fairly similar. It was probably about 100 as well. We break down audit recommendations based on essential or high level, desirable, medium level, and best practice. As you see, we didn't raise any best practice ones this year because we felt that the weaknesses in control warranted the recommendations actually being categorized as desirable or essential. When I had the chairman's briefing last week, the chairman asked me to cite some examples just so that at member level you can get an idea as to the differences between audit recommendations that are essential and desirable. So, for example, we did the fraud audit last year, a couple of audit recommendations there that were desirable. The first one was that all staff need to be reminded to declare all guests and hospitality within the agreed procedures for the council. We felt that that was an important control that we needed to make sure as a council we were following. And the second one, we don't really have too much fraud awareness training going on at the council. Obviously, we have an induction process for new staff where that area is touched upon. And from time to time, we have IT security and those sorts of training provided for staff, but we don't really have a dedicated fraud awareness training. So we've asked management in the anti-fraud and corruption team to come up with an e-learning package. And again, we class that as a desirable rather than essential. So an example, Mr. Chairman, of an essential recommendation is, for example, in the waste audit, we asked Joint Waste Services to work with Amy, the service provider, to ensure that all necessary backup data is provided to the council in order for us to verify and make sure that the invoices that we're being provided in order for payment were actually correct. So there was a bit of a backlog in that. We hadn't actually agreed with Amy what the supporting data should look like, and there was a lot of toing and froing, but I felt that it was that critical to the integrity of the waste contract that JWS actually moved those negotiations forward. So that's an example of an essential recommendation for you. Really, the rest of the report talks about a breakdown of the audits we covered last year. So the first section is key finance audits. So those include things such as treasury, capital, debtors, creditors. So those are the audits that have more of an influence on the accounts for the council in terms of income and expenditure. Now, as many of you know, those are annual audits. We do those cyclically. So we would hope that unless there's been a dramatic turnover of staff or lots of new changes in procedure, we shouldn't really come across too many new errors, because obviously if you audit them year in, year out, you would hope that if you're doing a good job, you wouldn't find too much new in the following year. So fingers crossed we don't find too much in those areas. The other schedule audits, these tend to rotate every 2 or 3 years. So payroll we do every year. So we cover the payroll system in terms of looking at starters and leavers and payments to those officers to make sure controls are working. Joint waste, we did a massive audit with the JWS team to make sure that the control parameter, the contract controls were in operation, such as performance indicators, making sure that invoices were being paid properly. Quite a few recommendations were there, and the good news is JWS have actioned all of those recommendations. Procurement, we did quite a big piece of work looking at tendering process and awarding of contracts to third parties. So that's quite a critical area in terms of expenditure. So we raised quite a few recommendations there, but at the time of the audit report that I've written, none were due for actioning. A big piece of work, we work with the property team to make sure that they're properly investigating any potential property purchases in terms of due diligence work and making sure safeguards are in place, and working with agents to make sure that the necessary questions are being asked. So I covered a lot of that work with the property team, and that resulted in quite a few recommendations that I'm working with the property team to make sure they get actioned in the next few months. And really the rest of the report follows a similar format. Some health and safety audits, obviously that's quite topical at the moment with a pandemic, I guess. So we're working with the business continuity team as well as the in-house health and safety advisor to make sure that risk assessments are being done properly, staff are being properly provided with PPE equipment, for example, and so on and so forth. We did some audits around Camberley Theatre, leisure services. ICT was quite a big one. Obviously, we've rolled out a lot of cloud-based services where we're not relying on physical service anymore. Rather, our content for the council is being saved up into the cloud, and we're working with bots to provide that. So obviously, I had to ask a lot of questions with the ICT team to make sure those controls are being properly managed and the service is being supervised. An interesting one is the fraud prevention section audit, especially the comments that members made tonight. From a personal point of view, we didn't come across any possible or noticeable areas of fraud conducted by officers, because obviously my audit focused on the integrity and the behaviour of officers rather than at a member level, and I didn't come across any significant issues, and I reported as such. And that's really it. I won't go into the rest of the report, Mr. Chairman, in much detail because it's in front of you for members. But I'm happy to take any questions or any clarification of the report as members wish. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think it's worth noting in the minutes that you and your team, small though you are, played a lot of prominent roles in the COVID response, and thank you for that. Any members have any questions? Councillor Bates.
Thank you, Chairman. I just would like to know, in terms of the escalation processes for audit recommendations, there's a paragraph in there that explains it a little bit, which says any essential recommendations that have not been satisfactorily actioned, and I presume we mean within the time frame that is expected to have been done, will be escalated to CMT and to member level as necessary. And I suppose the question is, does that actually happen in terms of escalating to members? Because if there is overdue essential recommendations, then really that should come here, in my view, so that we can then identify them. And you did say earlier, as part of the discussion with departments, there's a bit of toing and froing about it, and sometimes they don't necessarily agree with the recommendation because of resourcing. Well, that to me is a concern, because if the issue is purely one of resourcing, then that is not an audit issue in my mind. That is a management of resourcing issue, to which we may need to look at that either with senior management or with members to help identify resourcing. That isn't, to me, an audit issue. Audit is about whether the correct processes are in place, not about whether we can afford them. So that perhaps that's my misunderstanding, but I think if we can just be reassured regarding that all essential recommendations that are out of time do get escalated to members, and what that process is, please.
Thank you. Alex, yes.
If I can respond to a couple of those points as best I can, Councillor Bates. In terms of the toing and froing, I think for clarification is more in terms of the category levels of the audit recommendations rather than them not actioning them. So I felt that if a control weakness was significant or serious enough that it warranted immediate attention, I would class that as essential. The toing and froing is more in terms of, well, the service thinks it's desirable because it's not that critical to the service or the authority. But so that's really where the differences are, in terms of we have to provide a target date by which each recommendation needs to be actioned, yeah? And we need to agree that with the service. Now, obviously, there's no point me imposing a target date which is so unrealistic that as a team they cannot deliver that. And therefore, I'll come down on them a ton of bricks at the end of the target date and say, look, you've not met that recommendation because you haven't actioned it by the agreed date, and therefore I will escalate it to management and members. It needs to be at a sensible level, and that's where the resourcing issue comes in. Because if I'm going to recommend a significant issue with them, they need to allow sufficient time to get the bodies in place and get the systems in place to make sure that control weakness is going to be adequately dealt with. There's no point imposing, because most of our essential recommendations need to be immediate. So we're asking them to action them, as a priority and not put it back 3 or 6 months. Now, that's where really the toing and froing is. It's not that they don't agree with the control weakness that I'm raising as an issue. It's more in terms of how it can be successfully delivered within the existing resources of that service. Does that make sense? And the second point, can you remind me of the second point again?
Yes, it was about the escalation to members.
Oh, the escalation.
And at what point does that actually come so that members were then aware of that? Because I appreciate it's going to be a little bit of time at members that within your time frame, but if that hasn't been done within the time frame agreed, you've escalated to CMT. Yeah. What is the member involvement then?
Okay, so in terms of escalation, when these audit reports went to CMT for their comment before hitting the agenda of audit and standards, that question was raised by management. I then proceeded to do a an exercise of the 110 audit recommendations that we have raised, including those that weren't yet due. And there are, to be honest with you, I think as it stands at the moment, there are 2 recommendations out of about those 110 that haven't been actioned. So you're talking about, you're talking about less than 2%. And at this stage, we're still working with management. So one of them is actually rolling out training. The reason it's not been actioned is HR are trying to investigate a cheaper solution to try and roll out that training with other service providers. So I guess I wanted the training to be done ASAP, but in order to achieve that, obviously during the summer, we're trying to work with other service providers and other councils to like piggyback on the top of their, on the back of their training. So that's fraud related training. So that's one example where it hasn't been actioned, but I didn't feel at that point, and I did tell management that, they still need to explore those avenues of approach. So I think the 2 outstanding recommendations, action has been taken to partly address them. But in terms of black and white, they've not been actioned as per the audit wording, but they are investigating the best possible way in which they can deliver those. So again, by January, if they've not been successful in actions and I haven't worked with management to make sure they've been delivered properly, I'm more than happy, Mr. Chairman, to put that onto the agenda of the January or the March committee, if that's okay.
Thank you. Councillor Bates, that answer your queries? Perfect. Councillor Page.
Thank you very much, Chairman. It just pricked me then when we were talking earlier and just now about the training in gifts and hospitality and fraud type training. I've just myself been on some e-learning on this subject with the civil service, and I would just make a recommendation that that package that the civil service have is very good. I wondered if we have some kind of access to that or something similar. But if anybody would like help on that, I can research that for you.
Thank you. I guess, Alex, you can follow that up.
I can do with Councillor Page. If I'm happy to speak to Councillor Page outside this meeting to see the content of that training and see if it's suitable for officers at an officer level.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Malvaganam.
Thank you, Chair. Alex, I mean, I must congratulate you. With a very small team, you do tremendously hard and a long job, and particularly this year with COVID-19, pulling most of you and most of your staff away to do the job. Totally appreciate what you guys do. Couple of small questions, but I mean, possibly Steve to also listen to the answers. On the capital expenditure, regarding the process, procurement process, I know you've done some work this year. How often does it go? Do you actually do it on every purchase, or do you select the year to rotate it? Because these are big purchases going on. For example, we are doing a lot of work now, the REM work in the town centre, and there's going to be a regeneration of the town centre, etc. How much does the internal audit department get involved in that whole process of issuing contracts and monitoring it?
Thank you, Councillor. In terms of procurement and property, that's on our plan to be reviewed each and every year. So there will be some procurement audit done this year. Unfortunately, the investment and property audit that you saw highlighted in this report, some of that audit was started in February and March, and some of it was tested and the report wasn't finally agreed until the summer. So it's part of last year and part of this year, but it's my intention to go back and revisit some of those key significant issues with the service before the end of the financial year, making sure that they're being adequately dealt with. In terms of the procurement side, again, we've got a dedicated audit in the plan, and it's our, with every will in the world, our aim will be to make sure that the procurement audit is done within the financial year as well. And again, we don't look at every big contract, we take a sample of contracts. So we look at small value contracts, medium value contracts, as well as some of the higher value contracts. to make sure that contract standing orders, financial regulations, the constitution are all being properly managed. Payment, expenditure thresholds and tendering thresholds are being proportionally applied, proper quotations are in place, and so on and so forth. So there will be some testing, but we don't cover the entire population because it's not possible. So we do a sample testing of procurement each and every year within that audit. But on top of that, councillor, don't forget, if we're looking at an audit and they procured a big expenditure, for example, or they spent a lot of money, we will be looking at that particular procedure of expenditure within those specific audits as well. So if we're looking at licensing system, they bought a new software package, for example, which is £50,000, as well as looking at licensing controls, we'll be looking at the expenditure over that piece of software as well to make sure that tendering rules were followed. We went through the due process of getting proper quotations, and companies were shortlisted, and so on and so forth. So we look at procurement audit, not just in the procurement audit itself, but also within other individual audits across the council throughout the year. Okay.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Anyone else? Yes. Councillor Hawkins.
Thank you, Chairman. Yeah, and just touching on that, I mean, the work that Alex does is only part of the overall checks and balances. And we have professional officers who are charged with executing their work within the roles. And Alex is just part and parcel of the overall thing. So if there is a major acquisition of the licensing software, or has been in the planning software, if I dare mention that there are other checks to ensure that the right procedures are followed, the right research and the right authorities are taken on board before a purchase goes ahead. And then Alex's team will then subsequently check that through. So it is only part and parcel. It's not the be all and the end all. It is just part of a process, as I understand it.
Thank you. Anyone else? Questions for Alex? No? Thank you very much, Alex.
Thank you.
Moving on. Alex.
No, that is me again. Again, if members allow me, I'm just going to dip into my report on screen. So apologies if I'm looking strangely at my screen. It's modern technology. So this is the second report. Again, it's brought to members' attention once a year. Again, this should have gone to the July committee, but it's now being brought to the attention of the November one. So this follows quite a prescriptive format, in that the format and the template of this report, members might note, doesn't really change year on year too much. So there isn't much scope for annotating the report in a lot of respects. But the purpose of this report is to conduct a review of the effectiveness of the system of internal control. So obviously that's our job from an internal audit point of view, where our role within the council is to provide an independent assurance to services that their procedures and their policies and the way staff are doing things are being done correctly. And as Councillor Hawkins said, we're just one area of assurance. We don't provide a combined assurance. That's done by regulatory authorities like health and safety, for example. They will be independently reviewing their area within health and safety just as much as us doing an independent review. So basically, I see our role as of internal audits providing that bird's eye view of how services are delivering their services to the public, making sure that financial regulations and other council policies and procedures are being properly followed, and to highlight any significant defects from that. So this report basically summarises how we go about doing that and what our remit is as an internal audit team to make sure that that process is happening properly. So we're covered by what's called the Chartered Institute of Internal Auditors. So we're qualified through them, and so we work alongside CIPFA as well as the Institute of Internal Auditors to make sure that our audit process is delivered as best as it can be. And we have to demonstrate that process through what's called 8 criteria. And again, the format of those 8 criteria doesn't really change year on year, but we need to make sure we've got a proper mandate. We have unrestricted access, so that if we're carrying out an audit, officers shouldn't really be stopping us accessing data or records, as long as it's in the best intentions of that audit. Obviously, the records need to be appropriate for the area we're looking at. So we should have unrestricted access, for example. We should be sufficiently funded to make sure that we're doing our job properly. And again, obviously, budgets are set out at the start of the year, and each service has an agreed budget, and that's discussed at management level. We need to make sure there's effective leadership and staffing in place. Obviously, I report key audit findings to senior management as well as members, and I've been doing that for quite a few years now, I'm guessing. And then really the second, if I can move on to the second part of the report, which is section 4 onwards. So this is the second half. So this talks about improvements to the system of internal audit that need to be reflected last year based on what we identified the year before. So we came across 3 areas. One was ensuring that internal audit continued to meet the changing needs of the council landscape. And what I mean by that is the council isn't sitting still in terms of how it's delivering its services to residents. It's changing and continually adapting to meet the needs of the public. So obviously changes to how we go about delivering our services electronically, looking at different communities that are now populating Surrey Heath. Our demographics isn't what it was 10, 20 years ago. So we're looking at how the council's managing that process. And as Mr. Chairman, you mentioned earlier, obviously there's been a lot of effects on COVID-19. So we touched upon that at the end of last year, because obviously the pandemic kicked in at the end of March, when we're still working in our 1920 financial year. So we need to make sure they're being adequately dealt with. The second key area for improvement was making sure we continue to meet the needs of the annual plan. Obviously, the annual plan is quite demanding. We need to make sure that the plan recognises that the council delivers a whole range of services to a whole range of public. We can't be specialised in just 1 or 2 areas. We have to make sure we can audit as many areas in the council as possible, and giving structured feedback to managers of those services. Now, when I last counted, there were 50+ service areas in the council delivering different functions. And obviously our job is to try and cover as many of those as we can. So you can see the issue at hand there. We carried out a peer review with other local authorities to make sure that what we were doing as an internal audit service is being mirrored in our neighbouring local authorities, such as Spelthorne and Elmbridge. And we worked with those authorities in the last couple of years to create an action plan to make sure we're delivering those as properly as possible. And we're still working on that action plan and making sure they're being actioned as much as possible. And we will continue to work on those. And I'm happy to provide members of feedback on that next year when hopefully more results are known on that. The final part of the report, Mr. Chairman, is about challenges for the upcoming year. So obviously we're now, over halfway through this year, so it's a bit late in reporting this. But the 3 areas that I felt that we needed to give substance to our audit work, one was joint waste, partly because of the cost of the contract to the authority. It's a significant value contract, and partly because of the number of issues we had with the way JWS and Amy were working last year. So I needed to make sure that somehow our audit plan captured those risks, significant risks, and making sure that we can provide some sort of assurance to management that they were being dealt with. The second area is organisation restructure. Obviously, that's going to have an effect on every service we look at, simply because obviously at the end of the day, the services are being managed by their executive heads and line managers, and we need to make sure that that's being properly looked at senior management level. The third area, and again, I raised this, Mr. Chairman, in the report because, again, of the significant value. Obviously, buying properties is fairly new area to the council. We weren't doing this really 10 years ago. And as an internal audit team, we need to make sure that all the audit issues that we raise with the property team are being dealt with over the next few months. So I've included that as an area of significant concern as well. So in conclusion, we have to provide a conclusion to the report. So I said that the council continues to operate an effective system of internal audit. With a caveat, obviously, we are running with limited resources. We are a team of 2. And obviously, if one person goes down due to self-isolation or COVID or anything like that, obviously there's a significant issue there. But touch wood, so far, everyone's been healthy and will continue to do so. So the report's asking members to, I think, bear with me. It's asking people to note, that's right, and to comment as appropriate, Mr. Chairman. So I'll pause there for any questions, if that's okay.
Thank you, Alex.
Okay.
Anyone have any questions for Alex on his report? Sounds like a good report. Thank you.
Thank you.
Moving on. Sounds like Vicar of Dibley, doesn't it? Annual standards report.
Okay, good evening, Chair, and good evening, councillors. So the report you have at item 7 is the Monitoring Officer's annual standards report, and essentially the report just provides some key highlights of the standards issues that I've had to deal with during the year, well, primarily since April when I started. So just to take you through the report very briefly and just to pick up on some of those highlights, at 1.3, that paragraph just references some of the changes to the Constitution that have been made, and the key changes that have been made are in reference to the Chairman's casting vote and the officer member protocol. Looking at paragraph 1.8, I think one thing that has surprised me since I started at Surrey Heath is the number of complaints that I've received against councillors, primarily parish councillors. The number of complaints are, in my view, unusually high. I'm not quite sure the reasons for that. It does seem to me that some of the parish councils are having difficulties, and there are some conflicts within some of the parish councils, and I think that's probably a factor that's generated a fairly high number of complaints. So myself and the Deputy Monitoring Officer have been working with the parish councillors, attending some of their meetings, providing some mediation and providing support and guidance to the parish clerks to help them through some of the governance issues and try and get them on a more stable footing. So I think at the moment now, touch wood, things are more stable on that front and things seem to have calmed down. Other elements of the report are just referencing the new arrangement that we have with Elmbridge to share myself as the monitoring officer, and from my point of view that's going quite well. And the report also references the report that went to the executive this year about Field 81. I won't go into too much detail on some of these because I think most of the councillors are probably aware of the contents of this, of that report and some of the other matters within this report. So, you know, if members have any questions, I'll be more than happy to answer them, or any queries.
Thank you. Councillor Bates.
Thank you, Chairman. I only have one, which is in relation to paragraph 1.8, which the monitoring officer has alluded to. I was surprised to see how many complaints there had been. I had only been made aware of a couple, and I do accept that we can't go into the detail of the specific complaints tonight. But the last line is of particular interest, where it says some complaints comprise of several allegations against the same members. And it struck me that there's two things that could be done about that. If the member, and I appreciate that at parish level, this isn't always the case, but every borough member is a member of a political group. And I think it's always been the case that political group leaders would want to know about repeat concerns. So if it's against the same members and there's more than one allegation, people might make a mistake. But if they're making several mistakes or several complaints are being made, then clearly there's a wider issue that we need to be aware of, and that groups and group leaders can have a role to that. But secondly, if we're talking about individuals who are not members of any groups, and I'm aware there's a number of people in that category, what training is specifically available for them in order that they could perhaps receive either, I don't know, mentoring or guidance to help them on their way?
Okay, so in terms of the first question and potentially alerting the group leader to some of these issues, I do need to think that through a bit more carefully, because that has been mentioned to me before. But I've always looked at complaints against members very strictly in terms of confidence. So if I receive a complaint, then usually nobody will know about that except the people that need to know. So I'll have a think about that, and perhaps we could have a discussion offline as to whether how we can take that forwards. But generally speaking, I'll keep the complaints confidential. On the second point about training, myself and Julia have invested a lot of time in providing advice and guidance to councillors. And to some extent that guidance has kind of strayed into coaching and mentoring to some extent. And we've also spent a lot of time with the clerks, essentially trying to help the clerks deal with governance issues at meetings, help the clerks to better understand the rules of debate, how to apply the rules of debate, and how to help councillors perform better at meetings and providing advice and guidance at meetings. So that's taken the form of myself actually attending some of the meetings and then helping the clerk, and then talking to the clerk offline about issues as well, to try and help them, help members, if you like. So that's kind of how we've addressed the training issues so far. But if there's more we can do, then we will. But I think at the moment things do seem to be getting better. There are a lot less complaints now, and some of the parish councillors know that if they feel like they may be getting themselves into a situation, they'll pick up the phone and talk to us first, and we can almost to some extent preempt what may otherwise be more complaints.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Hawkins.
Thank you, Chairman. I wasn't quite sure if the serial complaints were against a parish or a borough member, but be as it may, it does matter, because some of the parish councillors are independent, or more independent than the borough councillors. But slightly unhappy, maybe too strong a word, slightly nervous about the comment about the group leader not being told of any complaints, singular or repeated, against one of that group member, because at the end of the day it could bring in that group into disrepute, and I just feel that maybe needs to be thought through a little bit more and maybe discussed amongst the leaders groups, which I appreciate seems to take up about half the council. But if there is somebody that is constantly causing complaints to be made against them, whether they're unfounded or otherwise, I really do feel that that group leader should be made aware, and that is an issue that can be dealt with in group, because it may be quite innocent, but it could bring that group into disrepute. I take the point. I take the point, and it's something that I need to think through, and perhaps there's a discussion to be had offline there about how we can accommodate that. But the difficulty I have is every councillor that is subject to a complaint, I owe a duty of confidence, and that would be to any councillor. And so the easy answer to that was, if
if the councillor that is the subject of the complaint was quite happy for me to talk to the group leader, then problem solved. But if they understand that it's a confidential process and I won't be discussing it with members, then it is a difficult circle to square, isn't it, about involving the group leaders and then potentially other councillors becoming aware of it, particularly if the complaint is about something sensitive. And it is a difficult situation. I've had this at my previous authority when councillors have been the subject of a complaint, which potentially is a malicious complaint, and they say to me, yeah, but if it gets out, you know what people think. And so it's almost a way of trying to protect councillors' reputations, and people don't need to know if it's a vexatious or malicious complaint. Then it shouldn't really be publicised any further. So I think that's a circle that I'm going to have to try and square. And I accept there might be a way that we can accommodate that. I don't know. I mean, I'm kind of thinking aloud now on a sort of committee meeting, but I'm certainly happy to have the conversation to see if there's more we can do in terms of involving the group leader. It could be that if there's a particular problem at a parish council where there's a large number of members from a particular party, then the general problem, perhaps the group leader could be made aware of that. But I think the difficulty I've also got is actually establishing whether a councillor is a particular problem or not, because I am aware that in some parish councils, complaints are being made simply because one councillor doesn't like another councillor, and they continue to make complaints when there's nothing in it. Now, I wouldn't want to go to a group leader and say this councillor has been subject to 4 or 5 complaints when I know there's nothing in it, and then it's caused an issue when I know there isn't one. So it's not a simple. It's not always a simple problem, and it's not always a straight solution in terms of how we deal with it. I've got to take all the factors into account to make sure that what I'm doing is proportionate, and also keeping that duty of confidence. But more than happy to talk about this offline and see if there's anything else I can do better.
Thank you. Councillor Bates, you wanted to?
I just want to pick up that some of these, I do accept what's being said, and to be fair, the monitoring officer is very good at the role, because I was only aware of 2, and both of the 2, which I won't go into, but are very well in the public domain. So the other 15 I don't know anything about, and so they are kept confidential. So I've no idea if that involves any of my group or not. But I think there is a need, particularly when matters are already in the public domain, to have, and particularly when there's a repeat allegation where there is where we're talking about informal resolution. We're not talking about malicious complaints. In my experience, the very few that have come my way in my group have always been informally, and their group leaders, the group members always wanted to speak privately about it to date. And generally, and they've been found not to have any foundation for whatever reason. But I think there is a role, and I do accept it's sensitive, and I think it would be helpful to have that conversation offline, because there is a balance to be had here, and I think it helps the overall running of the process, because I don't want senior officers dealing with 2 complaints every month. There's a lot, in my view, and I think we should be looking to address that and take responsibility for it.
Thank you. Councillor Galliford.
Just going back to training for parish councillors, I mean, South put on a very comprehensive training programme, and I think it's more about actually trying to get councillors to engage with that more than anything. So that is available for everybody who's a parish councillor. I think a lot of the problems, are really about councillors coming together and talking, as Councillor Bates has said. So, yeah.
Thank you. Anybody else? Any comments? Thank you very much for your report. And that brings us to the last item on the agenda. Date of next meeting scheduled for Monday, the 18th of January. I hope you all have a good, healthy, happy as you can be Christmas and New Year. And I'll see you all in January. Thank you very much.
Okay,
good night.
bye.